Welcome back. I'm Alan Fisher and I'm in Belfast, Northern Ireland, talking to Martin McGuinnes. And I asked him if the lessons learned in reaching a peace deal here can be transplanted elsewhere in the world, particularly the Middle East.
I think that the critical element in the situation in Iraq is for Iraqis to come together. And of course there are many different opinions, many different views. It's fair to say that in Helsinki, it was clear that the Iraqis were far more interested in what happened here in Ireland, even than they were in what happened in South Africa. I mean, the sight of Ian Paisley and myself coming together on May the 8th had a very profound impact, I think, on all of them. And they listened very, very carefully to what we had to say. And I think they recognised that they have a massive role to play, that they all talk about being Iraqis, about their allegiance being to Iraq. And the case that I made is that, you know, the quickest way to hasten an end of conflict in Iraq is for the different parties in Iraq to come together and to make agreements which will see a new leadership flourish. And we'll see what is obviously a huge aim of all of the different groups in Iraq, see the Americans lead their country. But I mean, it's a very complex situation. There are many forces at work, not just internally within Iraq, but outside of Iraq. Many people have their eyes on the prize or potential prizes for them. And I think that this will require, you know, a considerable skill, negotiation. But I think the key to all of it is to see the people of Iraq, through their political representatives, come together, get into the driving seat, dictate the pace of change, and to put it up to everybody, including the external forces. And I think if you can get that unity, and it remains to be seen whether or not that will happen over the course of the coming period, if they can achieve that, then I think anything is possible.
Do you think the Iraqis left here happy with what they saw, perhaps confident that some of the elements in Northern Ireland could be transplanted to Iraq?
Well, I thought it was hugely interesting that just a matter of weeks after we had met with them in Helsinki, that they sent a very sizable delegation of Iraqi parliamentarians to this very building, in Parliament buildings in Stormont. And I know that there are still ongoing discussions taking place and that they are still keen for us to be involved. And we have obviously offered up our willingness to participate without claiming to have, you know, delusions of grandeur about ourselves, or that we have the ability to resolve the situation in Iraq. We clearly don't. That will require contributions from many, many other people. But I think that if we planted the seeds in their minds about how they can resolve the conflict, if we set them thinking about the examples that they learnt about the situation here, if they can put that to good use for themselves, then I'll be well pleased if it saves one life in Iraq, never mind 100 or maybe tens of thousands. So I think that this is has to be all part of a process. I'm encouraged by what I heard. You know, some of these people weren't even speaking to one another when we arrived in Helsinki, and by the time we left, we were sitting across the table from each other, and people were involved in what I consider to be a real engagement. It's still in its early stages, but I hope and pray that the mood for peace will grow, and I hope and pray that the politicians in Iraq, from the disparate parties that are out there, will recognise their responsibilities to the people that they represent. You know, one thing is for sure, in many conflict situations throughout the world, and it was the same here in Ireland, there wasn't going to be a military defeat of one side over the other. Sometimes that does happen in very extraordinary circumstances. So I think there comes a time when people have to sit back and reflect on how progress can be made. And I think remarkable progress has been made here, and that we have been, if you like, in charge of what is undoubtedly one of the most successful peace processes in the world today.
You were talking about the role that Tony Blair played in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. He now has, some would say, a much bigger job as the Middle East peace envoy. Do you think he can make any difference there, given the dealings you had with him over a decade?
Well, you know, it comes back to this word leadership. I mean, it's not in the nature of any Irish Republican to give credit to any British politician or Prime Minister. But I would be a fool not to give credit to Tony Blair for being the first British Prime Minister in the history of Britain's relationship with Ireland to seriously set about learning about Britain's relationship and even admitting, as I did do in private conversations with Jerry and I, that the British had a massive responsibility for what was happening here over the course of many decades and indeed over the course of many centuries. So he has made a very important contribution to resolving conflict on the island of Ireland. Can he do a good job in the Middle East? Well, that remains to be seen. I think that he has a massive handicap, and the handicap is obviously the situation in Iraq, the association with George Bush, the suspicion that's in the Middle East about all of that. But he's in this job as envoy, and I wish him well. If it helps bring peace to the Middle East, then I think that we all have to assist in whatever way we can. We should all encourage as many people as we can in that situation to contribute to a meaningful peace process.
So if he came to you and said, Martin, come and speak to these people and tell them how we did it, you'd be quite happy to go and do that?
Oh, at the drop of a hat, without having delusions of grandeur about, how that would influence people. We don't have any prescription for how to resolve the situation in the Middle East. The people who have to come up with the prescription are the people who live there. I've been twice to Sri Lanka. I've been to Sri Lanka where, I went there initially at the invitation of the president of Sri Lanka. First time I went, I met with political representatives of the Tamil Tigers, but didn't meet the Tamil Tigers because of the security situation in the northeast. I was very unhappy about that. Within a few months, I had told them I was unhappy about that if they wanted me to go back, I wasn't prepared to go back unless I was in a position to meet both the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government. And I did go back within a few months and met with the Tamil Tigers in Kilanachi in the northeast, and met with the president and 6 or 7 of his key ministers, but came to the conclusion that neither side was ready for meaningful negotiations, that both sides believed that they could gain more territory, have more military victories over each other. I told them that that may well be the case, but if that is the case, if that is the mentality here, this war will go on for many, many more years, and many, many more people will die and lose their lives. If there's going to be an agreement, go for the agreement now, negotiate now, because sure as day following night, you will have to negotiate at some stage up the road, so you're better to save lives and do it as quickly as possible. They haven't yet learned that lesson, but that's a very, very clear message that I have, and I think similarly the situation is true in the Middle East. Everybody has maybe an even greater sense of what the outline of an agreement will look like in the Middle East. So the argument is a very compelling argument. If you accept what the final solution is going to be in terms of how the two nations can coexist beside each other, then negotiate now and do the business and save life.
Did you ever think that Northern Ireland would become a beacon of hope to places of conflict around the world, when they can look and say, well, look what happened there. There was a 25-year armed conflict, and now suddenly there's peace on the streets.
Well, casting myself back 25 years, I would never have imagined 25 years ago that it would come to that point. But I mean, people get older, people get wiser, people recognise that, you can't fight forever. And I know people who were prepared to fight forever. Or you can try to conclude an honourable agreement. An agreement which will allow you to pursue your aspirations. I mean, I'm a United Irelander. My primary political objective in life is to bring about a united Ireland, but to do it now by purely peaceful and democratic means. I have the solution to do that. The route map to do that is in the agreements that we have made in the course of recent times. Now, obviously, Ian Paisley comes at all of this from a different perspective, but Ian Paisley has a large mandate, as I have a large mandate. I respect his mandate. He and I have worked together, knowing what each other is, knowing what we felt about each other for a quarter of a century. But we have worked together, I think, very positively and very constructively. And the great strength in all of that for us is that we know that we do that with the overwhelming support of the people, that there is huge support for what we're doing. There are micro groups out there on both the loyalist and so-called Republican side who are totally opposed to everything that we're doing, who are trying their damnedest to bring it down. They haven't been able to do that. I don't believe they will be able to do that because they don't have the necessary support out in the community which is required. And I think that ultimately the hope has to be that these groups will give it up, stop, recognise that they can hold their political objections to the agreements that we have made, and espouse those objections in a democratic way. That I would, fight to the bitter end for people's right to do that. But what they have not got the right to do, against the backdrop of the overwhelming support that there is for this peace process, is to try and plunge us all back into a further cycle of injustice and conflict, violence and death. I think that's where the line has to be drawn.
Do you take a great deal of pride of what's happened here?
You know, the place that we were at before, in terms of the politics of this island, wasn't a very pleasant place for any of us to be. Where we are now is a far more pleasant place, and I think that's what people want. And the key to all of this is to deliver for the people, the long-suffering people, a better future for themselves, but more importantly, a better future for all of our children.
And if others can learn that, you'd be delighted.
Well, I would love to think that the lessons that can be learned from the situation in Ireland can be applied, even to a small degree, in other conflicts throughout the world. But, you know, the key point and the key message for people involved in other conflicts throughout the world, particularly people in positions of political leadership, is that it's down to you. You have to do it. If you think that someone is going to ride in on a white horse and bring victory for you militarily, you're living in cloud cuckoo land. What you have to recognise is, if you want peace for your people, if you want to achieve your political objectives, then at some stage, particularly if that conflict has gone on for decades, then there's a duty, there's a bounden duty and responsibility on political leaders, whether they be people who are involved in parliaments or people who regard themselves as politicians who are dressed in camouflage gear and carrying an AK-47 rifle. And of course, all of these people are political. They have to give leadership. And leadership is difficult, it's not easy. You know, difficult decisions have to be taken, unpopular decisions have to be taken. And I think the mark of any leader is the strength of character to stand up and say, well, this is the way I think we should do it. And that's what we've done here. We've sought support for what we've done. And we've got that support from the people. Ian Paisley has got that support from the people who support the DUP. And we've now come together, and we're in with a very, very real chance of the most remarkable political breakthrough ever seen in the annals of Irish history for some 800 years.
Martin McGuinnes, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.